Special thanks to Affordable Prestige Cars of Glastonbury, of course, for providing the Jaguar in this review, and those of you who follow this channel and my previous reviews will of course know that they pretty much always have a healthy stock of Jags, let's put it that way. So if you are in the market for something like an XK in this part of the UK, then of course give them a look via the link in the description right below this video. If this particular review is your first introduction to my content, then the first thing I'm going to say is there is a whole lot more Jag XK related content on the channel. So if you are curious about other versions of the XK, be it the R, be it the newer shape, be it even something as powerful as the XKRS, including showdowns that I've done comparing this shape to the newer shape, etc., then of course there is a lot to watch here on the channel if that floats your boat. Even my own XK experience of removing my mufflers, putting various other modifications on it to see what kind of changes it could make, etc. So I'm not going to get into every nook and cranny of the lineage in this video. However, I wanted to drive this car because, in effect, this kind of rounds off, at least to some degree, my coverage of this initial shape. Now, for those who are less familiar with the Jag XK, this is what's called the X100 generation car. There are two that you need to know, the X100 and the X150. This X100 car is the OG, came out in the 90s, ran till the mid-2000s, and it has that torpedo-shaped body. The later car, the X150, which is the one that I owned, looks much more like an Aston Martin DB9. It's the sharper, more aggressive shape with the aluminium body, and it's more of a younger man's car, you could say, generally speaking. Now this particular one has that OG style engine, the slightly smaller 4-litre AJ series V8, but this is not quite the oldest of the old because the astute eye will of course notice a couple of small updates that this one has, probably most notably from the interior. Instead of the 3 circular dials in the middle of the dash, it has the small digital Jaguar display. So this is a 2001 car, but it still has that 4-litre engine. Now these came out originally in super late 1996, October. Most of the ones that you'll see on the market run from 97 to 2006, and obviously by the time 2006 came around, it was in its final form with the facelift, the extra low side skirts, a number of updates, bigger engine, more power, etc, etc. And I've even reviewed the faster version, of course, the XKR of this shape, here on the channel as well, so be sure to give that one a look. Now, one of the things which I found the most interesting about driving this car, because those of you who do follow the series know that I'm not a huge fan of this older shape, generally speaking, more just for personal preference reasons, it's actually a car which has stood out to me even more than the XKR did. Because this car to me has one of the clearest purposes, especially now looking back at the car, to any version of the XK on the market. This, I would go so far as to say, is the purest, simplest, most direct sports car of any XK I've driven. And the reason why I would say that is because I simply put don't consider any other version of the XK or XKR that I've driven to even be a sports car at all. They are, as far as I'm concerned, GT cars first and foremost, and that's regardless of the 2+2 seating. This is a sports car first and a GT second. The reason why I say that is of course what we're going to get into, but to start that off, it's mostly about the performance. Yes, it has a 4-litre V8. Yes, it has just under 300 horsepower, just under 300 pound-feet of torque, which is almost 400 Newton meters. Those are fairly big numbers for a lower level sports car. But look at the kind of company which this car would keep today. Not in 1997, not in 2001, but today in 2022. The kind of used prices, the kind of performance which this would compare to example, a mid-2000s sports car, or even something after 2010. What kind of company does it keep? Well, honestly, the kind of person who's going to be looking to buy something like this might even be considering something like a Mazda MX-5. maybe a Honda S2000. That is not the typical kind of rivalry that a Jag XK would have, and that is why I believe it's such a different approach. No other version, even this older XKR with the 400 horsepower supercharged engine, it just doesn't keep that kind of company. You don't compare those to MX-5s and S2000s, you compare them to Bentleys and Astons, justifiably so. To me, that's a crucial difference, because that alone is the single biggest deciding factor in whether or not you should even consider buying one of these. This is the kind of car for someone who only and specifically wants a Jag XK to be their pride and joy, their sports car for the weekend, to put the roof down, enjoy the weather when we can, and have more of a kind of fun approach to performance wherein you enjoy every second of it at every speed, rather than just wanting to hear the supercharger whine and put all that power down and get the back end out. It's just not that kind of car. This is, I would say, less a modern E-Type. That's more the XKR in my opinion, and this is more like a modern Triumph Spitfire. That's the way that you should think of this. Less power, less of a focus on raw performance, but more affordable, more playful, and more attainable. This is, of any XK, the one which would scare an older driver the least. It's familiar, it's comfortable, it's calm, but it's fast enough when you want it to be. Now, speaking to that performance for a second, the version which I'm driving here, which is the open top, and of course you'll see from some of the angles that I barely fit in this car at all, which is one of the main reasons why I'm not a fan of the older ones. This one looks even worse than the coupe which I drove last time, is that these cars have more of a traditional Jag approach. As I said in that other video, in my opinion, the way these cars ride feels more like a two-door XJ. It's like an old school Jag approach. It's a modern classic, it's a little bit softer. Yes, it does wallow a bit more through corners, but again, that kind of suits the sort of driver who would probably want one. It's a bit more of a cruiser than it is a performance machine. Speaking to that performance, the 0 to 60 on this is about the 6.5 to 7 second range, depending on the hard top or the open top, and the top speed is around the mid 150 region. So it's, simply put, not that quick by today's standards, but for somebody who would want something like this, that's more than quick enough. What though about that engine? Because of course one of the key things which got updated through the Jag's history was going from a 4 litre to a 4.2 to add in the supercharger on the performance versions, etc, etc, and you'll get people ask, I will certainly get messages and comments, which engine should I go for? Especially on, 5 litre versus 4.2, for these older cars, do I go 4 litre or 4.2? Well, I actually looked up through forums and fellow owners' experiences what the key differences can be between them. And as I always like to say, if you have owned one of these, or if you do own one, feel free to please drop your thoughts, maybe agreeing or disagreeing with what I've said, and of course adding your own experiences for potential other owners to benefit from down in the comments of the video. From what I could see though, the key differences in terms of improvements and reliability comparisons between this and the 4.2 litre is that these earlier cars sometimes have more of a tendency to timing chain and tensioner and chain guide issues. The cylinder linings can sometimes be an issue, but one of the payoffs to the older engine is that most people find it to be smoother due to the altered physical proportions of the engine being a squarer unit. I can actually say from experience now, considering that the R that I drove was the 4.2 and this is the 4 litre, it actually does feel that way. This is a very smooth engine. It's still more than sprightly enough to be considered quote-unquote quick, but it does feel much more adept at being a cruiser, as I've alluded to. Now, speaking to values, speaking to what you should be looking for when buying one, well, of course, as with any car, look for a car that's been treated well. That will probably be easier with something like this, because most people who do buy an older XK, it's probably because they specifically wanted one. Now, in the UK at the moment at least, and XK prices do tend to fluctuate, and in the long term it's a fairly good investment of a car that you can actually use yourself, but these are dirt cheap. You can literally enter the market on an XK8 of this kind of era for like £3,000–4,000 without even breaking a sweat. Now for that, of course, you're going to be looking at much higher mileage, not the best of condition, maybe even needs some work, and that's the kind of thing that you need to look at. If you go for the end of run for this original torpedo shape, like a 2005, 2006 before the facelift to my generation of car, then you can actually pay as high as $20,000. So you really can pay as much or as little as you want realistically. I would actually say though that if you're looking for just that simple cruiser sports car approach, go for an older one, maybe even go for that 4 litre and get the oldest you can find. You will probably of course want to avoid a bad condition one or crazy high mileage, so you shouldn't necessarily expect to pay 3 or 4 grand. It would be more ideal to maybe look in the 6 or 7 grand region at least for a nice one that has been taken care of but is still not as expensive as something like the Supercharged R model. My overall thoughts on this car are that it makes a lot of sense. My controversial point on this one, as you can probably kind of tell, is that I actually like it more than the XKR of this era, because even though the one that I drove was technically the updated engine with the 4.2, I actually think that this car suits its place on the market more. The problem with the R version is, yes, it's more affordable than my shape, the X150, but you could just get an X150 for that kind of money. So yeah, get the older one if you prefer it, but if you're just looking for the raw performance and the sharper, more focused cornering, etc., then the newer car is simply the clear winner. This one though, well, it's so unique in terms of pricing, it's so unique in terms of its approach and its performance and its handling, that it just sits in this nice little space in the XK lineage, which even the newer version, the 300 horsepower facelift car, the base model of the one that I owned, which I've also praised in the past, even that one cannot quite match this one's just pure old school classic Jag sports car vibe, like a modern day, as I said, Triumph, a modern day MG, that kind of throwback experience of a sports car. Ultimately, it still has the same, you could say, drawbacks, quote unquote. Space, for example, for me is always a problem in these older cars. If you are not a fan of the softer, more wallowy, you could say, suspension through corners, you may have an issue there, but at the end of the day, those are things which you could change. If you find the space to be bad, then maybe buy the open top and only use it in summer. If, for example, you do find it too soft through corners, you could update the suspension, maybe even update the brakes here or there if you wanted to. So there are certainly options that you have. Ultimately though, that's it for my thoughts on this original. There will be more XKs featured on the channel as I weed out the rarer versions that I haven't done yet. The number one which I actually want to get my hands on is the XKRS 4.2 of my generation, the one which they only built 200 of, so of course stick around on the channel for that. But for now, that's it for my thoughts. Of course, as I said, there's tons more XK and XKR content on the channel, and drop your thoughts down below. But until next time, I'll see you then, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.